Welcome, everybody. My name is Eris Edie, and I am before you wearing a plethora of hats for this courageous conversation. We're going to be talking about abortion as liberation. And so I come to you not only as the Chief Equity and Learning Officer for Planned Parenthood of Greater Ohio, but I also come to you as the producer of JUNETEENTH4me, but I also come to you as a Black, bisexual, non-binary person from Cleveland, Ohio, and how those experiences have shaped what I know about abortion, how I'm able to access this procedure, and how I'm able to talk about it with my loved ones. And I'll be honest with you, I need help and I need support. And so I'm so glad that I have a wonderful panel of guests who are going to introduce themselves, their whole selves, and tell us a little bit about how abortion intersects with their work. We're going to also talk about how does abortion stigma within our community delay progress. And then we're going to talk about how to move the needle. Like, how do we start having the conversation with Black folks about abortion? How do we talk about it to our kids? How do we talk about it with our elders? How do we talk about it with our peers amongst ourselves? And then also, this work is very much connected to the legislative process. And so we get really, really tired of hearing things like being told to vote as if vote is the end all be all cure. And so we're going to really talk about what are some other voting practices and opportunities that we can think about that are outside just going to cast our ballot. And so I'm really excited to have these wonderful folks, Traci Person, Lique Gates, and Avery Ware. And so whoever wants to introduce themselves first, go ahead and jump in.
I'll jump in. Hello, everyone. My name is Traci Person. She, her are my pronouns. And as Iris described wearing many, many hats, I have the same privilege of doing so, such as being the senior field manager for Planned Parenthood of Greater Ohio, with the concentration of and focus of Black organizing throughout the state. I'm located in Akron, Ohio, and I'm also health chair for the Summit County NAACP. And, I'm a Black woman, I am a mother, and I am also a grandmother. So nice to meet you all.
Hey everyone, my name is Lique Gates. I am a senior strategist with a local civic engagement organization called Cleveland Votes. I also am a co-founder and owner of a community art space located in Cleveland, Ohio called Current Cleveland. I also wear many hats like Eris, like Traci, and like Avery. I have been doing reproductive justice work for the last 7 years. And so I come to you guys with humble hearts, open heart. I'm really excited to participate in this conversation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Avery Ware. I use he, they pronouns, but I answer to them all, to be quite honest. I don't even know what capacity that I should even, or all capacities. I don't know. I guess starting out, I am the founder and part of the leadership team of Mixed Juneteenth, a Black and Queer Liberation Celebration that is coming up tomorrow, actually, shameless plug. I'm also an educator and a writer. And I don't consider myself an activist, but a lot of the work I do does fall under that activism, advocacy umbrella surrounding a lot of different issues. I'm really honored to be a part of this conversation with these people that I respect so much because reproductive justice doesn't really fall under my wheelhouse in a concrete way, but tangentially, it's all related because none of these things happen in a vacuum, right? So I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation with y'all.
And I think that was a perfect segue. This work touches all of us. Reproductive justice in and of itself touches all of us. And so I would love to welcome Traci first. Could you just give us your definition of reproductive justice?
Reproductive justice, in case you did not know, was coined by a group of Black women who came together and saw that the voice of the Black woman is needed when it comes to reproductive freedoms. And when we say justice, it is a cross movement because it aligns with the focus of the presence of having food equity, housing equity, defunding the police. All of these things align with reproductive justice because healthcare is a human right and it should be accessible to everyone. Just like housing is a human right and should be accessible to everyone. Food is a human right and should be accessible to everyone. So, which is, as I mentioned, Planned Parenthood and the work that I do, because it is not a Black-led organization. It does not take the lead in reproductive justice, but we definitely support the model and we support the work that is being led by Black leaders and making sure that the work is equitable, specifically to Black people.
Thank you for sharing that. Avery or Lique, do you all want to add anything about your definition of reproductive justice before we move forward with this conversation?
Yeah, I just kind of want to echo Traci and say for me, equity and equitable access to welfare, specifically for those seeking reproductive care, is the forefront of reproductive justice. And I think oftentimes, like Traci also acknowledged, Black and brown people, specifically Black women or femme adjacent folks, are left out of that conversation, even though we are 4 times more likely to actually suffer in any type of reproductive care because people do not typically listen to us. And so as we have these conversations with medical practitioners, literally just highlighting that we're just trying to advocate for safety is something that I really find myself.
Thank you.
Yes, the one thing I will add about reproductive justice is its relation to labor and capitalism, which I think we'll get into a little bit more. But when I teach, when I'm in the classroom, I try to connect these different issues to larger, more umbrella issues that we can discuss and like really delineate. So I would add the element of like labor and capital as relates to reproductive justice and how harmful it is for these kind of restrictions are surrounding abortion and other things, and how directly relate to the advancement of white supremacist capitalism.
Okay. Thank you so much for that, Avery. So let's go into the discussion at hand. How does abortion in and of itself intersect with your work? I would love to start with Lique.
So reproductive justice care, and if we're going to speak directly, abortion intersects directly with my work, specifically my community organizing work, because I'm in the throes of it. I'm in the trenches. I've been tangentially involved with the local abortion clinic preterm that's included in Ohio for the past 6-7 years. And so having direct access to not only the staff that works there, but also seeing the patient care and even board level work has really, really driven home the harmful legislation that's been consistently introduced. I mean, it is forever coming. And just watching people countlessly give themselves and selflessly give themselves to making sure people continuously have access to body autonomy has been a really hard challenge, because there's only so many marches and speeches and things you can give and fundraisers you can give to consistently bring awareness to this issue that doesn't necessarily affect everyone, but it does, because somebody somebody you love has had an abortion. Whether or not they've told you that they've had it, they have. And the lack of safety and transparency around it is really alarming. And that is something that I find myself consistently working towards having conversations and trying to kind of decompress. And I'm never going to get into the stigma aspect, but that's something that I personally have taken on. I think education is really important. And so for me, it directly intersects with, even my professional day-to-day job. Education is at the forefront, and I always talk about reproductive care.
Thank you for that, Lee. Traci, can you add your voice to this conversation? How does abortion intersect with your work?
Well, it is the forefront of the work that I do, being a person that works under the umbrella of advocacy with Planned Parenthood of Greater Ohio. It is the, first off, it is the passion, because this is a hard job to actually be able to go out, specifically in Black communities, to first off, hear what the community has to say. What is those things that are holding you back, that is limiting you in, your choices? In working in the advocacy piece, of course, we have to fight for that choice. We have to fight for having the accessibility for it, but we also have to fight for clarity and for truth, to let people understand that what the louder voice, I always say, is, telling you something, whereas, 80% of the country believes that abortion should be accessible to everyone, but only 30% of that is really speaking out on it, and even less when it comes to the Black community. So I put myself in arenas that will allow myself to hear what the Black community is saying, so that way I can bring clarity and truth, so that those choices can be made based upon just that, and empowering them as far as making sure that they have the right people in legislation to support their choices, and so on and so forth, in their communities.
I keep hitting the wrong button. Avery.
I don't think one would think that abortion and reproductive justice falls under my wheelhouse. And as I said earlier, in ways it doesn't, but like Lee said, it affects us all in very real ways. It affects our politics. It affects our well-being, our material resources, all that good stuff. And the way that it does that is, again, I want to connect abortion to capitalism and to means of production and to labor. There was a tweet I saw right when the Roe v. Wade decision was leaked. Um, and this person tweeted that they were speculating that all these new abortion restrictions were directly correlated with the mass debilitating and the mass deaths that have happened because of the COVID-19 pandemic, right? We have less people working, less people want to have children based on the structure of the world. Like a lot of people in our generation and the generation after us are like, look at what's happening around us. We're not bringing no children into this world. That has been my stance since I was a child. And that was a long time ago, and I still hold that. So I guess the rationale is if we force these people to have these children, then we now have an inherent labor force that we can exploit for further means of production, right? And that didn't happen in a vacuum. That is kind of the foundation of this nation, right? So when I teach all American history, but I do focus on I don't know, pre-Civil War, I guess. So when I teach kind of some of these slave codes, one of the ones that sticks out to me and to my students is when one of the first slave codes they wrote was that the child inherits the condition of the mother, meaning that if an enslaved person, and I say person very intentionally because we say men and women of enslaved people, but we don't know how they identified themselves when it came to their gender. So when an enslaved person gave birth, no matter who the other parent was, whether that be a free Black person, whether that be a white person, whether that be an overseer or an enslaver, no matter who that other parent was, that child would still become a slave. And the rationale behind that is we already have an inherent labor force that we can use, especially after the slave trade was deemed illegal, even though they still were using the slave trade. They now had an inherent labor force where they didn't have to buy anyone. They didn't have to bring anyone over from a different continent. You already had an inherent labor force there, but you just had to wait a few years until you can start exploiting them for their labor, right? And that's not to say like, oh, what enslaved people went through and what we're going through modernly is the same, but the through line when it comes to white supremacist capitalism, it's very much apparent. So when we're having these conversations about abortion and why, like, do they just want to control women's bodies, or people who are able to have children, they just want to control their bodies? That's certainly a part of it, but there is a very strong element of capitalism and labor and who is owning these means of production and how many people can we exploit so they can keep their ruling class status. I think that I don't want that plot to be lost when we talk about these things.
Thank you for offering that very deep and depth perspective. It's something that I consider in passing, but never really just settle into, and that is alarming in its own way. So thank you for uplifting that. So we're going to move into the next part of our discussion, which is how does abortion stigma within our communities delay progress? So what are the ways in which we've had the conversation about Planned Parenthood and eugenics and abortion for years and years and years. And as real as the history of Planned Parenthood is as real as the present of Planned Parenthood is right now. We don't forgive or forget the origins of this organization, but we also acknowledge that this organization is doing very real work to close the equity gap and access to reproductive health care. And oftentimes the stigma of the past is delaying what we're able to do now and what we're going to be able to do in the future. And so whoever would like to jump in to speak to that, by all means.
I'll dive in. So thank you, Eris, for prefacing this conversation with that statement about the history of Planned Parenthood. I do feel like oftentimes in the conversations that is kind of tossed to the side, but it is a very real and dark and traumatic history that is important to acknowledge. But like you said, it doesn't take away the work that we're currently doing. For me, when I think of stigma, I always think of shame. I think of the shame that we carry within ourselves, the internalized shame that we have because of the things that we've been taught about abortion. And then also the shame of the community members. I myself grew up in church. And as a Black Christian growing up, abortions was not talked about. Body autonomy was not talked about. If you got pregnant, no matter what that process was, of you actually becoming pregnant, that was ignored. But the act of you being pregnant was a whole thing within itself, and you had to deal with it. There were no other options besides carrying. And so, continuing the conversation that there are more options, like we have options. We as people have more options than carrying to full term if we choose to not do it because of what Avery said. There are a lot of class reasons why people don't want to have children. If you can barely afford to feed yourself, why would you bring another body into this world? And so I think kind of reflecting the status of where we are and the generational trauma that we carried and the things that we're unpacking, having those options and destigmatizing the shame around abortions is extremely important. And the best way to do it is to have conversations. It starts with the conversation. It starts with that discomfort that we all need to sit with. Yes, it's uncomfortable. Everybody doesn't agree with abortions. Some people view it as, I'm going to say it, some people think it's murder. And, you're entitled to the opinions that you carry. But just like you have your opinions, I have opinions, and I should have opinions about my body. And so having those conversations, no matter how uncomfortable they are, is going to be the only way that we address the stigma in our community. And consistently ignoring it and trying to kind of be like, oh, those are the people that feel this way and those are the people that feel that way is not working. Because of that is why legislation is going as far as it is, because of the divisiveness in our communities. And so, like I said, we just need to start having these conversations.
Thank you.
I can go because I want to echo, and I hate to sound like piggyback off of what you said, Lique, about growing up in the church, the Black church specifically. I think that is something that limits our conversations and our understandings and our ability to move the needle forward. Is because we are so. And there's nothing wrong with it. Like, I still listen to T.D. Jakes at times, even though he can be very queerphobic. Like my parents, my family is still very much involved in the church. And I am tangentially, without getting too deep into it. So I don't want to shame the Black church at all, but I do think we're regressing a little bit in terms of conversations that surround things like abortion and reproductive rights and even queerness and divorce and things like that. Some of those, like, there are certain things I think in the Black church communities that we hold really strong to, that book says, that a lot of us kind of refuse to let go, or it's much harder to have deep conversations about because we feel so strongly about it, just because that's what we were indoctrinated to, that's what we always believed. So it's kind of hard to break that mode. But I do think it is standing in the way of progress when we hold so strongly to religiosity, Christianity, and specifically, and what that book allegedly says about what a person is able to do with their body, right? So I just want to speak true to that. I want to name it. Like, I want to thank you for bringing it up, because I think we would be remiss if we had this conversation and didn't bring up Christianity and the hold it has on on us in our communities, the stronghold. Speaking of church, the stronghold it has on our them the strongholds they want you to talk about, but them indoctrinated strongholds that we can't really let go of, that limits our progression.
Absolutely. As a church kid with a grandmother who was the superintendent of Sunday school, we were ways to just accept these moments and these moments of shame as law. I remember people who were a couple years older than me being brought in front of the church because they had gotten another person pregnant or what have you, and no. Immediately no. It's that type of shame ties into abortion stigma in such a real way, because if you can't even talk about intimacy or sex, there's no way that we can talk about things like birth control or consent or all of these other things that also created so much harm in a lot of Black churches as well. So thank you all for that. Traci, did you want to add anything to this conversation, please?
Yes, and thank you. And I plus one on what everyone has said, which aligns with the generational behaviors that have been passed down. May it be in the church or just the personification of Planned Parenthood, because of 100 years ago, this country, this land was not privy to Black people. And just like you couldn't go and open up a bank account, you couldn't live in certain places, you couldn't do a lot as a Black person, Black or brown person in this country. So it is the stigma that carried on throughout the generations when it came to Planned Parenthood, that as other stigmas were lifted, other things were lifted, like, okay, well, I now can live in this neighborhood. I now can go and I can do this. So everything else had its purpose of evolving into the accommodations of the Black and brown bodies of this land. But however, when it comes to Planned Parenthood, they continued this and held this organization from 100 years ago. But in actuality, Planned Parenthood has evolved as well. And the mantra that it holds to this day is care, period, no matter what, period. So it is to allow ourselves to be accessible to everybody, regardless. And we have to make sure that we are purposely and intentionally sharing this information so that those stigmas can be lifted, and being able to have open conversations. They may end up being hard conversations, but as long as you support the truth, they won't be as hard as all. So, just supporting the truth.
I mean, that's definitely a word, supporting the truth and just making room for it. And, making room for the fact that truth can oftentimes be incredibly uncomfortable, but it doesn't make it any less the truth. And so, giving ourselves grace to feel how we want to feel when it comes up, but also trusting the fact that, like, we are allowed to edit our perception. We're allowed to revise our understanding. We are allowed to welcome new thoughts and new beliefs as well. We do not have to get to a certain place and decide there's nowhere else to go. There's always room to grow. There's always room to welcome more. And so thank you all so much for that. And so let's move to the task at hand. How do we move the needle? We are not going to make a person who is vehemently opposed to abortion just in a 5-minute conversation change their mind. We know that. But how do we kind of etch away at it? How do we do kind of what they've done to Roe v. Wade? How do we chip away?
Yes, and
how do we chip away at it?
Yeah, so I would like to start this piece because that is what I do. As I mentioned earlier, how 80% of the country supports Roe v. Wade, but only 30% is speaking out. We have to get those other voices involved. We have to empower those to utilize their voice. One of the things as a Black woman, our struggle is being heard. So allowing ourselves to establish a platform so that we can be heard is the first thing, so uplifting those voices and uplifting the opportunity of speaking that truth and whatnot. So, just giving the platform, because and creating community. Community is definitely something that we, as the Black community, feel secure in, because if we don't feel secure, then we're not going to speak. So, building community and establishing a platform are the two biggest things that I feel that we're going to be able to move the needle. And then that other 50% out of that 80% that is not speaking, I would love to see their whispers turn into a roar.
Yeah, I definitely agree with Tracy. I think that that was extremely well put. Thank you so much, because community is the premise and foundation of any movement, and any organizing and any building. And so thank you so much for that. I'm going to actually challenge Eris. So I think that oftentimes we focus on moving the needle versus the start. It's really important to meet people where they are. And I've learned that, especially in a generational gap, with any legal issue, there's always going to be a lack of understanding and there's always nuance. And so, a big part of my journey from 2021, actually 2020, when the pandemic hit, I challenged myself to start applying grace to people in different ways, because we were all just trying to make it. We were all just trying to make it in whatever way and capacity we could. We were all trying to make it. And so that really shifted the way I did organizing work. Instead of me coming in like guns blazing, like, look, I need you to understand my issue and why it's important, and I need you to change your mind immediately on that issue. I kind of took a step back and say, so what do you know about it? And how do you feel about it? What is your approach? And the thing that works the most in most of the conversations I have specifically around abortions is I say, okay, so you wouldn't have an abortion, but are you opposed to somebody else having it? Are you opposed to somebody else making a choice that's different than the one that you would make for yourself? And if they say no, and I say, so then why don't you support the legislation behind it? And that has actually been really effective in those communications, because it makes people stop and think, just because I wouldn't do that, or just because it's not in my own personal beliefs, I shouldn't knock off access to somebody else, specifically those who might really need it. And I think that that is the way that we all can really start to move that needle, is A, applying grace, B, meeting people where they are, and C, just providing education. If people don't know, they don't know. But when they do know and they still make ignorant decisions, that's when we can start holding them accountable. But trying to hold them accountable and not necessarily knowing their knowledge level, I think that that's very ignorant on our behalf. And, as activists, which I know like every you say you don't identify as one, me neither, I say organizer. If we're going to be out here organizing efforts to make those changes, we really got to be graceful to the people that are in the streets, because they're not organizers. We can't expect them to know all the legislation that we know. We can't expect them to know the history of the organizations like Planned Parenthood. We can't expect them to know the work that you do, Tracy, as an advocate, or Avery, the work that you do in regards to Black liberation, or Eris, the many things that you do, the many hats that you do, including creating celebrations to honor our ancestors who wish they had options. Because a lot of our ancestors did not have options. They had to have babies. They had to have a lot of them in a lot of horrible conditions. And so, as we talk about moving the needle, we just got to kind of just apply grace. That's going to be my message on that.
I really appreciate that, Lee, because I think what you explained is a organizing tool, which what we call deep canvassing. And so when you're taking the time to have a conversation and connect, and that really is the tool of moving the needle, is creating connection, which is what you exhibited in that story, and then also offering them an option alone and codified with education. And so if you're really looking at ways to be able to start having those conversations, it always starts with connection, and likely lended to grace. Lots and lots of grace for yourself, but also grace for the people you're having conversation with. Avery, I would love for you to chime in.
Yes, I would love that, Lique. And Tracy, I echo what you said, and I'm going to piggyback off of what you said, because I know some people don't feel as comfortable speaking out, especially with a topic so sensitive as abortion and reproductive rights. But there are other options. If you don't want to be the voice, if you don't want your voice to be lended, or to be the loudest in the room, there are other options, like supporting the people that do. Supporting the grassroots organizations that are out here doing the work. Maybe that's something volunteering. Maybe that's bringing them water at their respective like sit-ins, marches, whatever is happening, rallies. Maybe that is in the most maybe impactful thing is with the dollar, lending your dollar, lending your money to these grassroots organizations, or to any organization that's doing the work. Or to individual people, individual organizers, activists. A lot of this is thankless work that they do. Again, I don't consider myself an activist or organizer, more of an educator, but all of it is a lot of thankless work, and a lot of it is a lot of free labor that we put in, and we do it because we love it, and we do it because it's necessary, and we have to, essentially. But we still, like, folks still got to pay bills. When we have our 9 to 5, and after our 9 to 5, we go to this rally, or we're organizing a rally, or organizing volunteers to do something. Like, that is compensation that is not seen. So there are other avenues, other ways to support if you don't want to speak out. If you, like, some people are shy, some people are introverts, some people are just scared for any reason. Maybe the communities they're in don't really support their views. Maybe it's an unsafe environment that they're in where they can't say anything for their own safety. And in no ways are we trying to encourage you to put yourself in an unsafe situation. But if you feel so inclined to support, but not speak out, there are other ways that you can support the work being done.
Thank you all so much. So we're about to round out this conversation, just with some good tips or best practices. I believe that we've already done some, but I would love to know about, ways that we can talk to specifically our children about abortion, and then how do we talk to our elders about it as well? Because those two, I believe that us as folks who are somewhere in between, we are those bridge builders, and we have the capacity, we have the education, and we also have the ability to adjust our message based on the group that we are working with as well. And so tips, tools, guidance about ways that you all have had difficult conversations across generational differences.
If you guys cool, I can start. So I think that just reframing what abortion is really important. So the premise of abortion is body autonomy. We are in control of our bodies. We have autonomy to make decisions over the bodies that we live and carry and walk around with every single day. Different levels of accessibility is also really important. So that's the conversations that I have. I used to work with youth. I taught literacy. And one of the things that I remember my 5-year-olds would tell me if someone would hit them or touch their body, I would tell them to respond and say, hey, please don't touch my body. And it kind of goes with the same. It's just the opposite. It is your body. And so if you feel a certain way about your body and the choices that you want to make, you should have access to do that. If you decide you don't want to do something one day, you should be able to make a decision that I don't want to do this anymore. And that doesn't change. And the same, that's the way that I kind of approach it with kids. I think with elders, it's a little different because there's a lot of trauma in our history as Americans, specifically as Black Americans. And so having a conversation about body autonomy is not as black and white because they have not always had access to their autonomy. They have not always been treated as human. And so recognizing that and listening to the traumas that they might carry, I think that the reframe around that is you now have access to that. You now have the autonomy to make decisions over your body. How are you processing that change? Because we know it's a change. We know it's different. And I'm thinking very specifically to my 91-year-old grandfather, who I've had the privilege of spending a ton of time with this week, and just how he navigates the world and just the ways that he talks to people. He still says colored. In 2022, my grandpa still says colored. And for a long time, I remember in my teens, I would be really uncomfortable with him saying it because he would say it in public. And then as I got older, I realized that some things are really hard to unpack and unlearn because that was what he was referred to as. So who am I to take away his history? He is literally living history. And so that's the way that I've always kind of worked on that reframe.
I thank you for sharing that because being a Gen Xer, I've been able to witness a lot of changes just within my lifetime. So understanding, and yes, I have been referenced to as being colored, and I remember when we were looking at that, so Negro, all of that. So I understand that, and I appreciate you giving grace to that generational phrasing. So the one thing for me, as far as having those conversations, is to acknowledge that abortion is healthcare. And having abortion and seeing abortion as healthcare, whether I'm speaking to a child or someone younger than me, to understand the aspects of healthcare should be accessible to everyone, that needs it. You know, just like I may need to have a tooth pulled, I don't want to have to go somewhere that it is deemed unsafe to have this tooth pulled because of uh, the danger effects that could happen. I should be able to go to a facility and to professionals to get that tooth pulled, just like if I am in need of an abortion, then I should be able to go somewhere where it is safe and by professionals to have this done. And that it is, accessibility where I don't have to travel um, miles out of state or anything like that to have healthcare accessible to me. And this is something that I would address both to the youth and to the older generations as far as, understanding healthcare. We, as a Black community, understand that the relationship with the healthcare industry and the history of healthcare with us has been strained and is still strained. We still have stories of healthcare concerns. So it is up to us to be fluent in having these conversations. And by having the conversations, giving and creating a comfort zone for us to be able to come together as one unit and demand that we have healthcare for all.
Yes, I echo both of your sentiments, both about the reframing, because it is framed in a way, like Lee said earlier, that abortion is killing children, which has impacted a lot of people's ideologies of why they're so anti-abortion. But I think reframing it as body autonomy, reframing it as healthcare that I have a right to, like everyone else has a right to, is really important for both elders and children. And I haven't had to have a conversation with an elder or a child about abortion or what it is. It may come. I have nieces and nephews, so it may come up, and them looking at me as the political person, the educator. I'm pretty sure those questions will be coming to me more than anybody else. But I can share an example of what I had a conversation with an elder about. Gender and gender identity. So a little bit different, but I think there's going to be some through line in the way that and the way that we can discuss these things with our elders. So it was actually my grandmother, and this was years ago. This is when Caitlyn Jenner first came out, and my grandmother has two queer grandchildren, me being one of them. And our elders will surprise you. They will surprise you in their willingness to learn and grow and develop. I think the traditional mode of thinking is that they're set in their ways and they ain't changing their mind. But I have learned that not to be as true, especially with people in my family. So when Caitlyn Jenner came out, we went out to dinner, and she was just confused about a lot of things. She was confused about what transness is, what a trans experience is, what happens with the genitalia down there, which I firmly said that's none of our business. But she just had questions, and having two queer grandchildren who are very much expressive in our queerness and our presentation, she was trying to wrap her mind around what all this means, right? So specifically, we're talking about names and name changes and identifiers and things like that. So I was like, Grandma, what if I'm not going to say her actual name. I was like, Grandma, what if I called you Angelique? And you said, no, my name is, you refer to me as Grandma. I am your grandma. I was like, but what if I just kept calling you Angelique, even though you told me to refer to you as Grandma? And they were like, I would feel disrespected. I would feel like you were coming for me. Like it would make me feel uneasy, make me feel uncomfortable. I was like, so the same thing translates there. Like Caitlyn Jenner, as much as I don't like them politically, Caitlyn Jenner's pronouns are she, her, and her name is Caitlyn. We have known her to be something different, but now she is saying that has changed. We should respect that change, and if we don't respect them as a person, right? And we respect each other as people. You respect your queer grandchild as people. You have queer people in our community that you respect. So it might take some adjustment. It might take some change. Like even now, I slip up with certain people's pronouns and name changes, and you just correct yourself and you keep it pushing. I was like, we can do the same thing with each other. And when I broke it down that way, she got it. Right. It was just someone talking to them as people. Like Lique said, I think sometimes when we talk about some of these larger issues, especially like as activists, organizers, educators, sometimes it can be very blunt and assertive. And I don't want to change anyone's communication styles, but people on the receiving end can the defense can automatically go up when they feel like we're coming from them when we're genuinely just trying to educate, right? So when you just put it plainly and maybe give an example that they can relate to, I think that helps people kind of digest information better.
Awesome. Thank you so much. All right. So, rounding out the conversation, we have about 5 or so minutes left. I would love to talk about, we are tired of being told just to go vote. Go vote. We're not doing this because we're not voting. We're only are we still like 13% of the population? Right. I mean, we do our job. Like, us voting is never an issue. The numbers show it over and over and over again. But we need to be thinking about what our voting health looks like, what our relationship to voting in general looks like. I did this conversation a couple months ago, and I said, you have to think about your voting practices like you would going to the doctor. Like, you have a primary care visit, go to your primary voting, you have to vote in your primaries as well, and so, like, what are some of the other things we need to think about outside of just go cast your ballot? Because we're tired of hearing go cast your ballot.
Yeah. So one of the things that I'm doing is like, you're a registered voter, now what? So teaching people and educating them what else they can do as a registered voter, such as holding those in legislation accountable. And you have to hold them accountable by finding out what it is that they're voting on and understanding how the process works, how a bill is introduced, how to get involved. If you agree or disagree with this introduction, you have a voice at that point. It's not just you have a voice at the polls, but you also have a voice during the process of creating laws for the land. So you can go in, you can speak your voice, you can give them your sides, and you can also let other people be aware of what's happening. Like, for instance, in the state house right here in Ohio, there are 31 bans against reproductive freedoms. And most people do not know that, because these laws have been created under the radar where people are not involved. These bills are introduced, they go through the process, and if there's no one opposing it, then guess what? They voted them in. And then we don't find out until we need the service, or, either directly or indirectly. So there are other ways to get involved other than being at the polls. Pay attention to what's being introduced in your states and locally, because it is the local changes that affect you more so than national changes. So, just educating, how that process works. So then that way you can get involved, and just by you getting involved can make that difference. So, yes.
Thank you, Traci. So this is where my professional hat comes in, because I work with a civic engagement organization called Cleveland Votes. And so, yes, voting is very important, but it's also not the end all be all. I think that a lot of times we often don't think about the access and the lack of access in voting. And it really does come back down to education. You only know what you know. And so if you're not necessarily aware of what's happening in the state, how are you going to necessarily vote? People tend to only vote or check off the boxes of the popular names. And if they don't really know the names, or they don't really know the bills, they don't know things like that, they don't tend to vote on it. And so I think that another way that people can really get involved is signing up for newsletters of local organizations. There's tons in Ohio that are doing this work specifically around abortion. Women Have Options, Ohio Women's Alliance, Planned Parenthood Ohio, Preterm Ohio. There's a ton. I just can't think of them off the top of my head. We are also in the era of social media. And so the way that we curate our social media homepages and timelines is really contingent upon the information that we seek to learn. And so look at the issues, look at the tags, Abortionist healthcare is a great tag on Instagram. If you click on it, there's so much information, just not only locally, statewide, but also nationally. So you can figure out what other states are going through. We live in a state that is literally trying to follow the premise of other states that are banning and doing all types of horrible things. And so kind of seeing what those other states are doing as preventative measures is a way for us to also start implementing those, to try to get in front of the train and stop it. Not get on the train as it's going, not get behind the train and try to catch up, but to get in front of that train and stop it is really important. And there are tons of organizations, including mine. Ohio Voter Fund is another one. Just a lot of different organizations that are really out here trying to do implementation around it. So yes, voting is very important. I vote. And I think it's important for other people to vote, because it's a form of power and a voice that we do have, that we can exercise. But if you have your own feelings around voting, getting involved in an organization, signing up for newsletters, finding out what's going on, donating. Let's be honest, money talks. If you have $5 to $10 that you can give, keep in mind, there are people that still are looking for access to abortions, and a lot of the clinics in the state don't only provide abortion services; they also provide other healthcare services as well that can still be affordable to other people. So your money does really help people have access. So yeah, there are ways to get involved.
Both of y'all said what I was going to say, so thank you. But I do want to just highlight, Traci, your point about local elections. Really important. When the one semester I got thrown into teaching government and policy, that's what I really imposed on the students who were 18 and 19, because a lot of them didn't vote, or just were able to vote in a national election. But I'm like, local elections is where, I don't want to say the real heat happens, but it's going to affect you in a very real and tangible way, right? So look who's on that ballot, look what they represent. Again, voting is not the end all be all. If you got one candidate that is anti-abortion and one that's pro-abortion, then your decision is easy based on which side you support, right? Lique, your point about newsletters and social media, just being up on what's current, following what other states are doing, like you said, because usually when one state introduces something, other states follow suit, right? And we've seen that in anti-trans legislation, we saw that in voting legislation, we saw that in abortion legislation, education, or restrictive, divisive education. Like when one state introduces something really divisive and just really oppressive, then other states tend to follow, right? So it's important to see what's coming, so then we can try to organize how to stop it. And again, if you don't want to organize, lending a volunteer service, administrative help is always needed. A lot of these organizations are short-staffed and running understaffed numbers. So if you can help in any way or donate, like Lique said. I would also say on the more radical side, if voting isn't really your stick or you're tired of voting, there are other and I'm not encouraging anyone to do anything, but there are other methods to get the attention of people whose attention you need to get. You can see the most recent video of Ted Cruz, who was in a restaurant, and someone was not happy about the way he handled that Texas shooting, and they let him know right then and there, right? There are videos that I think have become more popular on the internet. I think it's always happened, but from around the world, of regular delegate citizens that are approaching their elected officials and saying, what you're doing is not cool. We as the people outnumber you, so we're going to tell you what you're doing moving forward. And if you don't acquiesce, we're going to tell you what we're going to do after that. You might not like it. So there are other ways to organize and get the attention of elected officials without voting. But I think it's a both and, not an either or. And you pick which lane is right for you. All I would say is be informed and be cautious in any or both lane that you choose to drive in.
Yes. So much great information. This has been such a rich conversation. I'm really, really grateful that you all have joined me today to celebrate Juneteenth. If you are in the Cleveland area, please go check out Avery's event. Avery, go ahead and give a drop for your event as well. This is going to go live on Sunday at noon, but I believe that will still give people time to jump up and come to your event.
Yes, so Mixed Juneteenth, a Black and Queer Liberation Celebration, is on Saturday, June 18th from 12 to 6 p.m. We will have drag, music, a bunch of local vendors, a bunch of free community resources. We will have vaccine boosters available, free STI screenings, free HIV tests. Speaking of voting, people will be registered to vote. Equality Ohio will be there. Pro-Choice Ohio will also be present, educating about reproductive justice. Central Outreach will be there providing our testing. So it's going to be a really good time, a really rich time. If you were present last year, as soon as you walk into Black Punk Press, which is where it's being held, you feel the community response, you feel the love, you feel the freedom, you feel the liberation, you feel the education that is filled in that space, and all of that was intentional. This festival is free of police presence. We have the Hugh P. Newton Gun Club that is providing our private security. They are armed and do open carry. I always give that caveat just to make sure people are informed of what they can see. I don't want them to show up and see people with guns and be like, what's happening here? They are security. They are open carrying. And that was intentional as well. This is free of police presence for obvious reasons, but it's also Juneteenth, so police are not welcome for obvious reasons. We have parking across the streets. So if you were there last year, we did primarily street parking, but now we have a parking lot that we got from the city. And we have a gaming area. The Cavs are involved this year. We have large Connect 4 and different food vendors with vegan options. So we try to, and ASL interpreters. So we want everyone who wants to participate can come and participate. So that's, again, Saturday, June 18th at Black Punk Press from noon to 6 p.m.
I am so excited and thrilled for your event. And so because of that, I'm going to try to just drop this early so people can come as well.
I appreciate you.
And I probably just want to thank you for creating a space this brave. When I first started JUNETEENTH4me, I wanted to sit at the intersection of queerness and Blackness and spirituality and create a safe place for folks to be able to engage and tangle with their own healing in a safe place. And because I've done it virtual, I've always loved that I've been able to come to I love that I was able to come to your event and feel what I created virtually as well. And so I'm just grateful that I have folks who are similarly aligned and creating space for all of us to show up as our whole selves, every single one of us, which is what liberation should be about. And so happy Juneteenth, every single one of you all. May this day bring you a lot of peace. I hope that you pause and reflect on where we've come, where we are, and dream up the possibilities of where we're going. Till next time, peace, y'all.
Bye, everyone.